The early spring brought with it a fresh, invigorating wind that swept through the training ground where the novices were practicing the art of combat. Among them was Richard, a tall and sturdy young man with long chestnut hair, beginning his path as a warrior. His armor was simple and slightly worn, and his sword was already dulled from countless training sessions. Their instructor, Sir Hawkmoose, was strict with him, constantly pointing out his mistakes. His loud voice echoed across the field, drowning out the sounds of steel and shouts. "Hands higher, Richard! You're too slow!" he roared, watching every move of his protégé. But Richard was confident. He had already defeated 5 fighters before this, and this sparring session was not going to be an exception. His opponent, young and inexperienced, looked at him with anxiety, understanding that he was facing a skilled warrior. When the fight began, Richard immediately went on the offensive. He made a quick lunge, forcing his opponent to retreat. His sword moved smoothly and accurately, as if it were an extension of his thoughts. With each strike, he demonstrated his confidence and skill. The opponent tried to deliver a series of quick blows, but Richard easily dodged them, his movements as graceful as those of a dancer. He stepped to the left, then suddenly stepped forward, using the element of surprise. His sword came down on the opponent's defense with such force that he lost his balance and fell to the ground. The instructor fell silent for a moment, observing the scene. Richard stopped, holding his blade to the throat of the fallen opponent. His face remained impassive, but a spark of satisfaction gleamed in his eyes. He lowered his sword and extended a hand to help the young warrior up. Then Richard removed his helmet and smiled contentedly, catching envious glances from those around him. However, his triumph was short-lived. Suddenly, he received a blow to the head from the instructor's stick, displeased with his smug expression. Pain and humiliation flared in Richard's eyes, and he glared at the instructor, cursing silently. "Don't think you've already become a master," the instructor barked, looking at him with a stern expression. "You're just a novice. Remember that." Richard, seething with indignation, headed to the tent to change and remove his armor. On the way, he noticed a group of people intently watching the training. His chest tightened. These people had clearly come to recruit novices for some mission or task. Men in expensive cloaks and with important faces exchanged quiet comments, evaluating each of the young warriors. Richard knew this was his chance. They had recently been observing his fights as well. He hurried to change and headed to work. During the day, he worked in the forge, and in the evenings he came to the training ground. Here, instructors offered free fencing lessons. The kingdom of Ardentia always lacked skilled warriors, so the king took this step, training commoners who wanted to become knights. This was Richard's dream, especially since he wanted to become a guardian of the dawn. A special caste of knights serving the Order of the Light Flame, the kingdom's main religious organization devoted to the God of Light. Therefore, he dedicated all his free time to training. Working in the forge also hardened him. Being an orphan, he was taken in as a child by a blacksmith who made him his apprentice. The old man grumbled about Richard's hobbies, but the young man never gave up. Leaving the training ground, he headed to the forge, passing through the city's poor districts. Narrow, winding alleys were lined with crooked houses with sagging roofs and cracked walls. Along the roads stood stalls where traders offered their meager goods: fish, vegetables, old clothes. The smell of decay and smoke mixed with the aromas of food cooking on open fires. Dirty children played in the dust, chasing rags with sticks. Their faces were covered in soot and grime, but their eyes sparkled with lively interest in the world around them. Women, bent over, washed clothes in murky waters of ditches, whispering about the latest news and gossip. Men, tired and worn out from work, trudged along with heavy bags on their shoulders. Richard passed one of them, catching his sullen gaze. Finally, he approached the forge. Behind the blackened facade covered in a thick layer of soot stood his mentor, Randolph. He looked at him, nodding grimly, but there was a spark of pride in his eyes. Despite his grumbling, the old man respected Richard's determination and saw potential in him. Richard quickly donned a leather apron and was about to start working, but the old man interrupted him. "A new order came in yesterday," the old man said. "They say that marsh creatures have multiplied in the swamps outside the city, so the local constable has ordered a squad to be assembled to clear the area. They need swords." Richard nodded and continued his work. In the forge, it was customary to speak little. Once given a task, they would immediately get to work. After a couple of hours, someone burst into the forge. It was Richard's friend Olaf, the grocer's son, with whom he sparred in the evenings, and had become somewhat close. He was excited, his eyes wide, and words spilling out of his mouth with foam. "Richard, they sent me to tell you the amazing news. You've been accepted into the Order of the Light." Hearing this news, Richard joyfully set aside his tools. Throwing off his apron, he dashed outside. The Order of the Light was the lowest rank of knights who served the Church of Light. This was his chance to fulfill his dream. He ran through the narrow streets of the poor district, his heart pounding with excitement. He leaped over puddles, dodged passers-by, ignoring their surprised glances. The sun was setting, and long shadows stretched across the ground as he finally reached the training ground. There, Sir Hawkmoose met him, smirking at the joyful young man. "Run to the neighboring building," he ordered shortly, gesturing towards a large stone structure at the edge of the field. Richard wasted no time and ran in the indicated direction. His feet pounded on the cobblestone path, and his breath came in frequent hot bursts. Approaching the entrance, he noticed a staircase leading up and quickly began climbing the steps, filled with the smell of old stone and dampness. At the top of the stairs stood 2 guards. They were members of the Order of the Light. Each was clad in full armor of gleaming steel with the emblem of the Order on their chests, a shining flame surrounded by rays. Their faces were hidden by helmets with visors, leaving only their eyes visible. When he approached them, he introduced himself, slightly out of breath. "Richard, reporting as ordered." The guards nodded, and one of them opened the heavy wooden door. Richard stepped inside, finding himself in a spacious room. The room was modestly yet majestically furnished. The walls were adorned with tapestries depicting epic battles and legendary heroes. In the center stood a large wooden table covered with maps and scrolls. Several massive chairs were arranged around the table, and in the corner of the room, a fireplace burned, giving the room a cozy warmth. On either side were shelves with books and weapons, neatly arranged and gleaming with cleanliness. In the room, Richard saw 3 people dressed in the robes of the Order of the Light Flame. The first was an old man with long white hair falling over his shoulders and a beard that reached his chest. His eyes, deep and wise, sparkled with a benevolent glow. He was dressed in a white tunic adorned with golden patterns symbolizing flames. At his belt hung a dagger with a carved handle, and on his finger was a ring with the seal of the Order. The second was a young man about 20 years old. His short black hair was neatly trimmed, and despite his youth, his face expressed arrogance and self-confidence. He wore the armor of the initiated and carried a sword at his belt that looked new, but already bore the marks of numerous training sessions. The third was a middle-aged man, about 40. His face was covered in scars, and his dark hair was slightly graying at the temples. His gray eyes were piercing and harsh, as if he sought flaws in everyone who came into his field of vision. He wore the magnificent white armor of the Guardians of the Dawn, the highest title of the Knights of Light. Richard entered and bowed, feeling awe in the presence of such high-ranking figures. The old man was the first to address him. "Richard Fitz, we have studied the candidates among the local warriors and chose you for your skill. We have also reviewed your background and decided to accept you into the Order of the Light." Having said this, the old man fell silent, and the middle-aged man began to speak. "If you agree, you must take the oath. Repeat after me. I, Richard Fitz, solemnly swear to serve the Order of the Light Flame faithfully and truthfully. I vow to protect the innocent, fight against evil, and uphold the laws and traditions of the Order. May my sword always be aimed at protecting the weak, and my heart burn with a pure flame. I dedicate my life to serving and protecting the God of Light." Repeating the oath, Richard was overjoyed. He had always dreamed of becoming a knight. Once in his childhood, his village was raided and burned by bandits, and he was saved by a Guardian of the Dawn. It seemed to him at the time that an angel had stepped onto the earth, and he vowed to himself that one day he would join this organization, which held the highest reputation among the people. Soon the old man spoke again. "My name is Master Irwin. I head the right wing of the Order. This is Sir Goodwin. He leads the Knights of my wing. The young man is Sir Iron, head of the initiated. He will bring you up to speed. We are glad you have joined us. If you have any questions, feel free to ask." Richard looked at them and could tell by the face of the head knight that he was not too pleased with his arrival. But the main thing was that he was accepted. Master Irwin and Sir Goodwin left, leaving Richard alone with Iron. Iron, after giving him an appraising look, said, "You have a good command of the sword and potential. I was the one who recommended you be taken. But ahead of you lie even greater challenges, so be prepared." Richard thanked him, and the knight told him to follow him. They left the room and headed toward the exit of the building. The road led them through busy streets that gradually became more well-kept and majestic. Gradually, the noise and bustle of the poor quarters were replaced by the calmer and more noble atmosphere of the central streets. The Cathedral of Light stood on the outskirts of the city, right on a cliff that served as a natural defense against attack. Its tall spires, reaching for the sky, were visible from afar, and the stone walls were adorned with stained glass windows depicting saints and legendary heroes. The cathedral was the heart of religious life in Ardentia, and next to it were buildings belonging to the Order of the Light Flame. As they approached the barracks, Richard could not contain his admiration. The high walls, hiding the inner courtyards where the knights trained, inspired respect and awe. The windows were adorned with stained glass, through which soft light penetrated the rooms, creating an atmosphere of calm and nobility. Many monks and knights roamed around, going about their business or chatting. Sir Iron stopped in front of the large oak doors and, turning to Richard, noticed his reaction. "Impressive, isn't it? From now on, you are part of the knights who serve the God of Light, and you must not disgrace his honor," he said, eyeing Richard's blacksmith garb. Richard felt uncomfortable, also noticing the disdainful glances from the knights and monks passing by. "When you arrive at your quarters, be sure to change clothes," the knight ordered. He led Richard through the corridors of the barracks, explaining where the main rooms were located. they passed by a training ground where the knights were practicing fencing and archery. Then Iron showed him the dining hall where the knights took their meals. Large oak tables were set with simple but hearty dishes, and the walls were decorated with tapestries depicting the exploits of past heroes of the order. In the corner stood a massive fireplace, in which a bright fire burned, creating coziness and warmth. Finally, Iron brought Richard to his quarters. It was a small but cozy room with a single bed, a wooden table and a chair. A shelf with books and space for personal belongings hung on the wall. The window overlooked the inner courtyard where one could rest and read in the shade of the trees. "This will be your room?" Iron said, opening the door. "Here you will live and prepare for your new duties. You can go home and collect your things for now. You have until tomorrow morning." Richard looked around the room, feeling his heart fill with joy and pride. He thanked Iron, changed into new clothes, and hurried out of the barracks to return home. His path again lay through the city, but now each step felt light and quick, as his soul was lit by the light of a new life. Richard returned to the forge and saw old Randolph, who was sitting at the table, chewing dried meat and washing it down with cheap ale. The dim light from the oil lamp cast soft shadows on his face, lined with wrinkles and hardened by years of hard work. Randolph looked tired, but there was a spark of satisfaction in his eyes from the work well done. Richard fell to his knees before the table, feeling tears of gratitude welling up in his eyes. "Thank you, Master Randolph," he said with a tremor in his voice. "Thank you for raising me, for giving me the chance to become who I am now." The old man's face did not change. He calmly continued chewing, as if not noticing the storm of emotions in Richard's soul. When he finished, Randolph lifted his head and, looking at the young man, slowly nodded. "Get up, Richard. Sit beside me," he said, his voice low and steady. Richard obediently rose and sat on the bench next to the old man. Randolph poured him a drink from a clay jug and handed him a mug. "Drink," he said, and Richard took a few sips, feeling the strong drink burn his throat. "A hard path awaits you," Randolph continued, looking at the young man with a barely noticeable pride. "And though I will miss you, I am proud that my apprentice has reached such heights. The main thing is to take care of yourself." The old man's words tugged at Richard's heart. He thanked his mentor once again, then stood and headed for the exit. Ahead of him lay the local tavern, where his beloved worked. The tavern was located a few blocks from the forge. It was an old building with a sagging roof and wooden shutters, through which light spilled. Inside, there was a semi-darkness, illuminated by several oil lamps and candles. Long wooden tables and benches, worn by time, were scattered around the room. At the bar, made of massive oak, stood the tavern owner, wiping mugs. When Richard entered, his nostrils were filled with the smell of roasted meat and freshly baked bread, mixed with the aroma of cheap ale and tobacco smoke. In the corner, a fiddle played, and a few patrons conversed quietly, enjoying their evening. His gaze immediately found her, Liana, his beloved. She was busy serving the patrons, but when she saw Richard, a smile lit up her face. She quickly approached him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Richard, what are you doing here? Aren't you supposed to be at work?" she asked, her eyes filled with worry and joy at the same time. He took her hand, feeling the warmth of her palm, and quietly replied, "Liana, I have important news for you. I've been accepted into the Order of the Light. I've finally taken the first step toward my dream." Liana smiled widely, her eyes sparkling with happiness. She hugged Richard tightly, and at that moment, he felt that all his efforts had not been in vain. She asked him to wait while she finished serving the patrons. He sat at one of the free tables, observing the lively atmosphere of the tavern. As he looked around, he noticed a familiar figure in the corner. It was his instructor, Sir Hawkmoose, who seemed quite drunk. In front of him was his third mug of ale, and his face was flushed from the alcohol. Seeing Richard, he waved him over. "Hey, Richard, come here, lad, sit with me," he said, his voice loud and a bit unsteady. Without thinking twice, Richard approached and sat next to him. Sir Hawkmoose poured him a mug of ale from a large pitcher on the table. "Drink," he said, pushing the mug toward Richard. "Today we have a reason to celebrate." Richard raised the mug and took a few sips, feeling the strong drink warming his body. Sir Hawkmoose looked at Richard with his bloodshot eyes and then smirked. He downed half his mug in one gulp, cursed and said, "It's good that you joined those guys, but I had the luck to work closely with them once, and I'll tell you, they're not what they seem, so be careful. Understand?" Richard nodded silently, pondering the meaning of his mentor's words. This information left a slight unease in his soul, but he knew he would have to find out the truth for himself. They continued their conversation, exchanging stories about training and old times. Hawkmoose gradually became more friendly, reminiscing about his younger years and adventures. Richard listened, engrossed in the tales, and although his mentor's words of caution lingered in his mind, he enjoyed the moment. Finally, Lyanna returned, free from her duties. Seeing her, Richard felt a surge of joy and relief. She smiled at him, and they, bidding farewell to Sir Hawkmoose, went to a free table where they could spend time together. The tavern gradually emptied, and the atmosphere became cozier. Lyanna brought mugs of ale and some simple dishes. They sat together, enjoying each other's company and talking about the upcoming changes in Richard's life. Her support and care were invaluable to him, and he knew that with such people by his side, he could overcome any difficulties. The next morning, Richard woke at dawn. A young knight knocked on his door, waking him up, and informed him that everyone was being called to the training ground. Richard jumped out of bed, quickly dressed, and ran, trying to remember where the training ground was. Along the way, he noticed other knights moving swiftly in the same direction and decided to follow them. When he arrived, the knights were already forming ranks. Richard quickly found his place and joined the rows, standing shoulder to shoulder with his comrades. Sir Goodwin stepped forward, surveying them with a haughty look. "Well, gentlemen," he began, "we've received orders to go to the outskirts of the city, to the swamp area, and get rid of the pesky monsters. So gear up. We're leaving in half an hour." His words were met with a low murmur of approval and anticipation. Apparently, the knights had not gone on an excursion in a while. Richard, however, was anxious, as this would be his first time fighting for real. After being briefed, he headed to the armory. Richard had long awaited this moment. Finally, he would receive his armor. The armory was a spacious room with high ceilings, lined with racks of armor and weapons along the walls. The air was filled with the smell of metal and oil. The armorer, a tall and sturdy man with gray hair, handed Richard a set of armor that looked exactly like Sir Iron's, the armor of the initiated. It was made of sturdy steel, polished to a shine. The breastplate was adorned with the symbol of the Order of the Light Flame, a burning flame surrounded by rays. The gauntlets and greaves were light but strong, providing mobility and protection. Richard eagerly put on the armor, pleasantly surprised at how well it fit. The weight of the metal felt reassuring on his shoulders, filling him with a sense of confidence. This armor was not just protection. It signified his belonging to the order and his determination to serve and protect. Fully equipped, he looked at his reflection in a large brass shield hanging on the wall. He saw before him not the young boy who had recently arrived at the training ground, but a true knight, ready for any challenge. After donning his armor, he approached the armorer, who handed him a sword. The sword was magnificent, with a straight blade sharpened to a razor's edge and a hilt adorned with the symbol of the Order of the Light Flame. Richard took the sword, feeling its weight and balance, and unsheathed it briefly to see how the light played on the blade. He had reforged many swords in his life, but he had never managed to make such fine ones. They were made by special blacksmiths serving the order. Fully equipped, he returned to the training ground, where the knights had already begun forming a long column of 5. Richard saw Sir Iron, who was leading the initiated. Seeing him, he pointed the novice to his place at the end of the column. Soon, Sir Goodwin mounted his horse, looking down at the assembled. Raising the order's banners, they formed up and began the march toward the city's outskirts. It was a grand procession, organized for spectacle. The column was led by Sir Goodwin, followed by the Guardians of the Dawn on horseback, then the healers in wagons, with the initiated bringing up the rear on foot. As they moved through the city streets, their steps echoed off the cobblestones. Ordinary people, seeing the knights heading out on a mission, stopped their tasks and came out to watch the majestic sight. Men, women, elders, and children all watched in awe as the knights passed by. "Knights of Light," people whispered. "Real heroes!" Admiring glances and cheers accompanied them every step of the way. Children ran alongside the streets, trying to catch a glimpse of their hero. Women curtsied, men tipped their hats, and everyone expressed their respect and gratitude to the knights. Marching in the ranks, Richard felt his heart swell with pride. He realized he was now part of something significant, and understood the hopes placed on him. This moment was special for him, feeling his importance and responsibility for those around him. Soon the residential areas ended, and fields began to appear. Finally, the knights reached their destination. Before them stretched a sinister swamp. The dark, mist-covered water extended for miles, occasionally interrupted by islands of mud and sparse, bare trees whose roots seemed to reach out, ready to grab. The air was thick with the smell of decay and moisture, and the sounds of insects and croaking frogs created an oppressive atmosphere. The knights gathered for a final briefing, and Sir Goodwin assigned them into small groups of 3. Richard was teamed up with Sir Iron and another knight named Gareth. They began moving along the swamp, carefully scanning for their prey. Richard had never encountered swamp creatures before and had no idea what they looked like. These creatures had appeared recently, and people whispered that their arrival was a harbinger of coming darkness. Walking through the swamp was difficult, especially in iron armor. Richard frequently sank knee-deep into the water, making an unpleasant squelching sound in his boots. He was already beginning to tire, but continued on, following Sir Iron. Gareth brought up the rear, carefully watching their surroundings. Suddenly, Richard heard a scream. Turning around, he saw a knight being dragged down into the mire by something unseen. He was struggling desperately against the invisible force. Sir Iron reacted quickly, jumping forward and plunging his sword into the ground. There was a screech, and the creature momentarily released their comrade. They helped him out and stood in a defensive stance. From beneath the floating moss and algae, a creature emerged. It was a swamp creature, a hideous being with long, thin limbs covered in scales and slime. Its hunched body was covered in mud, and its huge crimson eyes glowed with hatred. The swamp creature moved on 4 limbs, making sinister clicking sounds with its jaws. Its mouth was lined with sharp, crooked teeth, ready to tear flesh. Richard stood in a fighting stance, looking at the approaching creature. Its menacing sounds and crimson eyes instilled fear. He had never faced anything like it. Suddenly, he felt weak in his legs and uncertain. Glancing around, he saw that Sir Iron and the other knight stood beside him, ready for battle. Their eyes shone with determination, giving him strength. Suddenly, the swamp creature lunged forward with incredible speed, its limbs flashing like whips. Sir Iron was the first to attack, his sword glinting in the air and striking a precise blow to the monster's limb. The creature screeched, but did not retreat. It lashed out with its powerful limb, forcing Iron to take a step back. Richard summoned all his courage and rushed to help. His sword struck the creature's scaly body, but the swamp creature turned and hit him with another limb. The blow was so powerful that it knocked him back into the mud, and he felt a sharp pain in his side. Seeing this, Sir Iron clicked his tongue in annoyance and continued the fight. Gareth took advantage of the moment, delivering several quick blows to the swamp creature, trying to distract its attention. The creature defended itself fiercely, making screeching sounds and trying to grab the attackers with its long limbs. Blood and mud mixed, creating chaos around them. Sir Iron re-entered the fray, his sword gleaming in the dim daylight, reflecting the determination and skill of the warrior. He struck with remarkable precision, severing the creature's limbs and forcing it to retreat. The creature screeched in rage, defending itself with its long limbs, but Iron was relentless. Each of his blows weakened the monster, making it lose balance. Despite the pain in his side, Richard tried to assist his mentor, striking where he could. Gareth also did not back down, distracting the swamp creature with swift attacks. The battle was intense and exhausting, but the knights did not give up. Suddenly, the creature panicked. Its movements became chaotic, and it rushed at Richard with wild determination. Its crimson eyes glowed with hatred, and it let out a piercing screech, preparing for a final charge. Richard gritted his teeth and braced himself for defense, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. Seeing this, Sir Iron reacted quickly. He leaped forward, whispering an incantation, and his sword filled with bright light. The power of the spell enveloped the blade, making it almost blinding. In an instant, Iron brought the glowing sword down on the swamp creature. There was a bright flash, illuminating everything around, and the creature screeched one last time before dying. After that, silence fell. All 3 of them slowly caught their breath, breathing heavily. The light from the spell gradually faded, and they stood over the fallen swamp creature, feeling exhausted and relieved. Richard leaned against a nearby tree, trying to catch his breath. His wound still hurt, but he was glad the fight was over. Gareth wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at Iron, who stood nearby, also catching his breath. After resting and catching their breath, the trio regrouped and continued their search for the monsters. The swamp creature was defeated, but Richard, Sir Iron, and Gareth knew that this was far from the only threat to the surroundings. They moved cautiously, carefully scanning every corner of the swamp, ready for a new attack. Throughout the day, they encountered various dangers, from small but aggressive creatures to treacherous quicksand traps. Time passed slowly, and every step was difficult, especially for Richard, who felt the pain from his wound. But he did not give up, continuing to move forward, following his comrades. As evening began to fall over the swamp, the sound of a horn echoed, signaling the time to return. All the knights, hearing the signal, began to gather together. They emerged from different corners of the swamp, many wounded and exhausted. Seeing their brothers in arms, they exchanged brief but encouraging looks. The trio joined the main group as healers rushed among the knights, casting healing spells. Richard received some relief, but the spells did not fully remove the pain, and he had to endure it. Once the healers had finished their work, the knights formed a column again and headed back. The formation was no longer as grand, with many limping and some being carried on stretchers. As they made their way back through the fields and villages, they were met by excited and grateful residents. People brought water and food, helped the wounded, expressing their gratitude for the protection from the monsters. Richard felt his heart swell with pride for his service and his comrades. When they entered the city, Richard was suddenly approached by his girlfriend, Liana. She immediately began examining him, clearly worried. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling with concern. "I'm fine, Liana," Richard replied, trying to reassure her. But suddenly, they were interrupted by an authoritative voice. It was Sir Goodwin. He rode up to them on his horse and stopped nearby. "Do not worry," he said, addressing Liana. "Your knight is fine. We all took care of each other." Liana thanked him, expressing sincere gratitude. Sir Goodwin responded kindly, but Richard noticed that his gaze lingered on Liana, a look of interest that Richard did not like. A bad feeling arose in his heart. "Thank you, sir," Richard said, trying to draw Goodwin's attention to himself. Sir Goodwin merely nodded, but his eyes were still fixed on Liana. Richard felt the tension rising and decided to return to the barracks as soon as possible. "We need to go, Liana. The healers are waiting for us," he said, gently taking her hand and heading toward the barracks. Liana watched them go as Richard and the other knights made their way to where the healers were waiting. Richard could not shake off the strange and insistent gaze of Sir Goodwin. He felt it spelled trouble, and his anxiety only grew. When they finally reached the barracks, they were dismissed, and Richard at last returned to his room. After removing his armor, he examined his wound. Fortunately, it was not serious. Then he lay down on his bed and fell asleep. The next month passed in continuous fencing training. Richard was also taught literacy and the basics of light magic. Sir Erwin often visited, monitoring the training and praising him. He told Richard about the order, and Richard developed a warm impression of the old man. Richard would rise at dawn and be the last to go to bed. His diligence surprised many, but also caused some discontent. "Why does he want to stand out?" they whispered. Despite this, Richard became friends with Gareth, with whom he had fought in the swamps. Within a month, he mastered the basic magical strikes, which were divided into 3 levels: Beginner, Sparrow, Intermediate, Raven, Advanced, Hawk. It was rumored that there was another level, Dragon, but no one had ever seen it. These names were not random. The basic spell at the beginner level, for example, summoned a light sparrow that circled with the sword and inflicted damage. With enough skill, one could attack from a distance. Richard was thrilled when he summoned his first light sparrow. The small bird made of light fluttered around his sword, emitting a soft glow. It was his first achievement in magic. What Sir Iron had done when he struck the swamp creature with the glowing sword was the highest level of sparrow control. The sword fused with the magic, becoming deadly. Richard aspired to master this skill. Days flew by one after another, and he became more immersed in training and studying magic. Sometimes he found time to visit Randolph and Liana. However, Liana had been acting strangely lately, and this worried him. The Festival of Light was approaching, and preparations were evident throughout the cathedral. Monks hurriedly went about organizing the festival, and the atmosphere in the city became increasingly tense and exciting. The long-awaited day arrived. The city of Noctum was transformed. The streets were decorated with garlands, lanterns, and banners of the Order of the Light Flame. The air was filled with the aromas of festive dishes and sweets, and the sounds of music and laughter echoed everywhere. The townsfolk bustled about, finishing the final preparations. Richard was assigned to guard the central square where the main part of the celebration took place. Residents gathered around the stage where performers, musicians, and acrobats showcased their talents. Food and drink stalls were also set up in the square, offering delicious treats for everyone to enjoy. After the morning events, it was time for the ceremony in the main cathedral of the Order of Light. Richard, along with other knights, ensured the safety during the solemn service attended by the high-ranking members of the order and important guests from the kingdom. Prayers, hymns, and blessings filled the cathedral, creating an atmosphere of grandeur and holiness. When evening fell upon the city, the knights were allowed to join the celebration. Richard, having removed his armor, headed to the main hall of the cathedral, where his comrades had gathered. The hall was adorned with candles and flowers, reflecting light in the stained glass windows depicting scenes from the Order's history. In the center of the hall, on a pedestal, stood a relic, the heart of the Phoenix. The orange crystal gleamed with a bright, fiery golden light, encased in a decorative metal frame encrusted with gemstones. Its shape resembled a heart, and the warmth it emitted filled the hall with a sense of grace and power. Richard approached, gazing at the artifact in fascination. His friend Gareth noticed his interest and walked up to him. "That's the heart of the Phoenix," Gareth began, his voice quiet and respectful. "This artifact was created by the great mage Eldrin many centuries ago. It contains a fragment of the essence of the Phoenix, the mythical firebird that symbolizes rebirth and immortality." Gareth continued to recount the artifact's history, explaining its abilities. Richard learned that the heart of the Phoenix could heal wounds, amplify magic, and even bring fallen warriors back to life. He was awestruck by what he heard. The celebration continued late into the night. When Richard wanted to return to his room, he noticed a group of girls being led by one of the initiated. This surprised him, but then he saw his girlfriend Liana among them. A sense of unease took hold of him. What was she doing here? He was about to call out to her, but something stopped him, and he followed them. They headed to the hall where the Guardians of Light rested, a place where others were not allowed. Only one knight stood guard at the entrance. As Richard approached, the knight raised his shield and sword, stating that entry was forbidden. Richard pondered what to do. Time passed, and Liana did not come out, increasing his anxiety. Finally, he decided to take a desperate step. Approaching the knight with a mug of ale, he pretended to be drunk, trying to distract him. "Hey, friend! Want a drink?" Richard slurred, swaying. The knight got angry and lowered his guard. At that moment, Richard struck him on the head with the heavy mug. Luckily, the guard was without a helmet. The blow was precise, and the knight was knocked out. Richard carefully propped him up against the wall and entered the hall. Inside, it was dim. On couches and cushions, knights sat, being entertained by women. Richard felt scared, feeling lost. All his high notions of these people came crashing down. He carefully made his way through, trying not to be noticed, searching for Liana. Soon he found his way to a bed with a closed canopy. As he approached, he heard a familiar voice, and his heart clenched. "Will you really make me your wife?" Liana asked seductively. "Of course," someone replied. "Just get rid of that lowlife." "Well, I haven't seen him much," she said. "So you don't need to worry." They fell silent, and Richard heard the sound of a kiss. He couldn't take it anymore. Pushing aside the curtain, he saw Liana in the arms of Sir Goodwin. He stood there, thunderstruck, and took a few steps back. "Liana! How could you?" he said, his voice breaking. Liana saw him and was scared, while Sir Goodwin just smiled smugly. Richard turned and ran out of the hall. Liana shouted something after him, but he heard nothing. He ran, not knowing where he was going. His thoughts were consumed by Liana's betrayal and Sir Goodwin's treacherous smile. His heart was broken, his feelings a whirlwind of pain and disappointment. Tears streamed down his cheeks, but he didn't notice them, lost in his suffering. Unexpectedly, he burst into a room and realized he had gone the wrong way. He found himself in a lavish room, furnished with luxurious furniture and decorated with tapestries depicting heroic scenes. In the corner stood a large fireplace, in which a bright fire burned, illuminating the room with a soft light. In the center of the room stood Master Irwin, the same kind old man who had inducted him into the Knights. But this time his face was angry, his eyes gleaming with fury. Beside him stood a man in a black cloak. He was bald with pale skin and sharp features. His eyes were cold and piercing, and on the back of his hand was a black circle with a red diamond in the shape of an eye in the center. When he noticed Richard looking at his hand, he quickly pulled down his sleeve and turned away. "Get out!" Master Irwin growled. Richard snapped out of his daze and began to apologize, realizing he had burst into the wrong place. He slowly backed out and left the room, feeling even more empty and confused. He returned to his quarters, wondering if he had made a mistake. His thoughts were chaotic, and he couldn't find peace. He lay down on his bed, but sleep did not come. His heart continued to ache. Only near dawn did he finally fall asleep, exhausted from his turmoil and suffering. Richard was awakened by a commotion as someone burst into his room. He barely had time to comprehend what was happening before he was grabbed by the arms and lifted. Around him, knights were searching his room, turning everything upside down. Suddenly, one of them shouted, "Found it! The heart of the phoenix is really here!" The knight held the stone aloft and showed it to the others. There were gasps of surprise, and Richard couldn't believe his eyes. He didn't understand what was happening, but he wasn't given a chance to speak. He was roughly dragged away, his questions ignored. Soon he was brought to a courtroom where people had already gathered. In the center sat a judge, and next to him stood Gareth. Richard was brought before them and thrown to the floor. He fell, looking around in fear, not understanding what was happening. The judge began to speak. "Richard Fitz, you are accused of stealing the sacred relic of the light, the heart of the phoenix. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" I didn't take it. What are you talking about?" Richard stammered in distress. The judge interrupted him. "The heart was stolen early this morning, and a witness said it was you." "Who is the witness?" Richard asked, unable to believe his ears. Gareth stepped forward. "Yes, it was him. I was sleeping in the hall and saw him sneaking away with the stone. I reported it to the head of the order immediately." Gareth's words stunned Richard. He couldn't understand how his friend could lie about him. What was going on? The judge continued, "Based on the witness's testimony, we searched your room and indeed found the stone. So there's no point in denying it." But? Richard tried to protest, but the judge cut him off. "Take him to the dungeon." The knights grabbed Richard and dragged him away. He couldn't believe what was happening. His heart was broken by the betrayal of his friend and the unjust accusation. Soon he found himself in a cold, dark cell, feeling utterly lost and alone. Richard spent several days in the dungeon, tormented by questions about who had framed him. He lay on the cold stone floor, recalling the events of recent weeks and trying to understand how everything had changed so quickly. Lyanna, Sir Goodwin, Gareth, they had all betrayed him. His heart was broken and hope for justice was fading. On the third morning, guards came to him. They silently untied him and led him away. Richard, dulled by sleepless nights and constant thoughts, followed them obediently. They emerged from the dungeon and walked through the corridors of the cathedral. Morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass, creating an illusion of beauty and tranquility that Richard could not feel. They exited the cathedral and headed toward the cliff. There, where the land dropped off sharply, was a magnificent garden. Flowers of all colors surrounded the paths leading to the very edge. Far below, miles beneath the cliff, Richard saw a dense, mysterious forest called the Forest of Shadows. Near the edge stood Master Irwin, looking out at the forest. The guards brought Richard to him and untied him. Richard approached the old man with hope. Master Irwin had always been kind to him, and he hoped for justice. As he drew near, the old man turned and smiled. "This ravine, according to legend, was formed after the Battle of the Titans," Irwin said, his voice quiet and thoughtful. "Great forces clashed here, tearing the land apart and leaving this deep scar. Since then, this place has become troubled. The legend said that two titans, embodiments of light and darkness, fought here for dominion over the world. Their battle raged for many days and nights until both fell, exhausted. The earth split open, consuming their bodies. And since then, the ravine had become a place of power, where the balance of light and darkness left its mark." When Master Irwin fell silent, Richard gathered his courage and tried to defend himself. "Sir, I was framed. I didn't take the stone." The old man remained silent, continuing to look at the forest. Then he turned to Richard and said, "I know, for I was the one who planted the stone in your room." "What?" Richard shouted. But at that moment, Irwin extended his hand and pushed him. Richard fell off the cliff. The depth of the ravine was immense. Richard fell, and in that moment, he saw the old man's face, which was utterly indifferent, as if he were killing an ant. Richard fell in despair, reliving the betrayals of the past days that had emptied his soul. He resigned himself, thinking it was better to die than continue living in this horror. He lost consciousness before reaching the bottom of the ravine. Richard awoke thinking he was already dead. Surprisingly, he was uninjured. Looking around, he realized he was in a forest. Suddenly, he felt someone behind him. Turning, he saw an enormous she-wolf the size of a house. She was a majestic creature. Her thick silver fur gleamed in the sunlight, and her eyes glowed with a deep golden light. Her powerful paws and long tail emphasized her grandeur and strength. His heart pounded, and he took a step back in fear. He wanted to run, but he noticed the she-wolf was injured and watching him. Could she have saved him? "Did you save me?" Richard asked, though he understood she was a beast and wouldn't answer. To his surprise, the she-wolf nodded. "But why?" he continued. She merely closed her eyes as if she didn't want to answer. Richard wondered what to do next when he heard a noise. Something enormous was approaching them. The she-wolf raised her head in alarm, clearly unable to run. "How can I help you?" he asked, but she only shook her head and lowered it again. "You saved me, so I'll do whatever I can," he said resolutely. The she-wolf looked deeply into his eyes, and suddenly something unusual happened. She began to glow, and from her emerged a ghostly glowing silhouette of a wolf. The silhouette started to run around and suddenly headed towards Richard. He didn't know what to do and wanted to run, but he didn't have time. Falling on his back, he felt a surge of energy penetrate him, and he groaned in pain. But soon it passed. He wondered what had happened to him, but he felt no different. The she-wolf lowered her head. It was clear that she had no strength left and might be dying. Richard felt pity for her, but the noise was getting closer. He heard the cracking of broken trees and bushes when suddenly an enormous snake emerged from the forest. Its scaly body writhed like a living stream, and its skin shimmered with green-black hues. Huge yellow eyes glowed with malice, and its mouth, full of sharp teeth, opened, emitting a hiss. Its long, forked tongue flicked in and out, ready to strike its prey. The snake lunged at the she-wolf, and a powerful tail strike sent Richard flying. He felt the ground shake beneath him, and stars danced before his eyes from the pain in his side. But then he felt something strange within him, as if a dormant power was awakening. The transformation began suddenly. Richard felt his body start to change, and he was scared. Bones cracked and lengthened, muscles expanded, and his skin was covered in thick fur. The pain was unbearable. Every moment felt like an eternity. He felt his face elongate into a muzzle, and his hands and feet turned into powerful paws with claws. He screamed, but his scream turned into a roar, and fear mixed with a new, wild energy. When the process was complete, Richard stood on 4 legs, his body covered in thick gray fur, and his eyes glowing amber. He felt incredible strength and simultaneous fear of what he had become. But there was no time to ponder. Seeing the snake coil around the she-wolf, anger and fury ignited in his heart. He roared and charged into battle without thinking of the consequences. His claws tore into the snake's scaly skin, ripping its thick coils. The snake hissed in pain but did not retreat. Its jaws snapped, trying to catch Richard. The fight was fierce and relentless. Richard fought like a berserker, losing himself in the battle. He didn't notice the wounds he received, didn't feel pain. Claws and fangs tore into the creature's flesh. Blood splattered everywhere. The snake defended itself fiercely, its long body writhing, trying to ensnare Richard, but he was faster and stronger. Every move Richard made was filled with rage and desperation. He felt his body bleeding but didn't give up. The snake tried to strangle him, wrapping its coils around his body, but Richard ripped through its scaly skin, inflicting fatal wounds. At one point, the snake struck him with its head, throwing him aside, but he quickly got up and charged again. The battle was intense and seemed to last forever. Richard felt his strength waning but continued to fight. He saw the snake weakening, but he was barely standing. Finally, in a decisive moment, he jumped onto the snake's back and sank his fangs into its head. The snake hissed and began to fall, its body convulsing in agony. Richard didn't let go, continuing to tear into its flesh until he finally felt the life drain from the monster. The snake collapsed to the ground, dead. Richard, breathing heavily, stood over its body, feeling the anger and fury gradually subside. But the wounds he had received were too severe. He felt his strength leave him, and his vision dimmed. He fell beside the snake's body, losing consciousness. In the last moment before darkness took him, he saw the she-wolf, who was already dead. Richard awoke again, this time finding himself in a bed in a house. The room was cozy and modest. Wooden walls adorned with carvings radiated warmth. The floor was covered with old rugs, and shelves with jars of herbs and medicines hung on the walls. In the corner, a fireplace burned, spreading soft light and warmth. On a wooden table lay several books and dried herbs, and above it hung an extinguished lamp. Looking around, Richard realized his wounds had healed, and he felt no pain. Then he reached out his hand and gasped. His hand was covered in fur. So it wasn't a dream. He jumped up and examined himself. He'd grown taller, like a very tall man, with enormous hands and feet. His fingers had claws that suddenly retracted like a cat's, and his hand looked almost human, except for the fur. He touched his face and realized he had a wolf's muzzle. Panicking, he rushed out of the room in search of a mirror but found none. Then he went outside and realized he was in the forest. In the yard, he saw a barrel of water and looked into it. In the reflection, he saw a werewolf, a creature with a wolf's muzzle, thick fur, and human features. Eyes glowing with amber light stared back at him in horror. His mind went blank. What should he do? Maybe he was dreaming? Suddenly he heard a voice behind him and saw an old man coming from behind the house with an armful of firewood. The old man was stooped and thin, with gray hair and a beard. His face was wrinkled, and his eyes were kind but shrewd. He wore simple woodsman's clothes, and his hands were rough from hard work. "Oh, you're awake, guest," the old man said. "Who are you?" Richard asked. "I'm just a forester living in this forest," he replied, heading into the house. Richard followed him. Inside, the old man began setting the table as if nothing had happened. Then he said, "I found you injured in the forest, but by the time I brought you home, your wounds had almost healed." Richard looked at the stooped old man, wondering how he had carried him. The old man brewed tea and poured it into cups, then offered Richard a seat. "Drink. You need to regain your strength," he said, pushing a cup towards him. Richard, still shocked by what had happened, slowly sat at the table and took the cup. He watched the old man, who calmly drank his tea as if it were an ordinary day. Then Richard asked, "Why aren't you afraid of me?" The old man, not lifting his gaze from the cup of tea, replied, "Oh, you're just a man who received the she-wolf's gift." "Gift?" Richard was surprised. "It's not a gift, it's a curse." The old man smiled. "It all depends on how you look at it. Some curses can become blessings if used correctly." They continued to talk. Richard told the old man about the she-wolf and how she had saved him. The old man listened attentively, nodding at the right moments. When Richard finished, the old man thoughtfully stroked his beard. "I don't know how to break the curse," he admitted. "But there is a mage living in the south of the country who might be able to help. His name is Ardon. He's known for his knowledge of ancient magical creatures and spells." Richard listened to the old man, feeling a new hope growing within him. He thanked him and returned to his room. Falling onto the bed, he sank into thought. The past resurfaced, and his heart ached with pain. He thought of Lyanna's betrayal, Gareth's lies, and Master Erwin's treachery. He didn't know what to do. Should he seek revenge or simply leave? And how was his old blacksmith doing? A fire of hatred slowly began to ignite within him, but he forcefully extinguished it and decided to focus on breaking the curse first. He needed to embark on a journey and find the mage Arden. This goal gave him direction, and he felt his resolve strengthen. Leaving the room, Richard saw the old man preparing food. He noticed his cup of tea still sitting on the table. Richard approached to drink, but with his wolf muzzle, it was difficult. Finally, he managed and savored the sweet aroma of the herbs. "Thank you for saving me and for taking me in. What's your name?" he asked. "My name is Eldon," the old man replied. "No need for thanks. We are all human and should help each other. I'm preparing food, but you can take a walk if you like." Richard went outside. The forester's house was small but cozy. Wooden walls entwined with ivy made it seem like the house was part of nature. The yard was well kept, with a small garden and flowering bushes around. Walking around the yard, Richard discovered a forge. "What is this doing here?" he thought, looking inside. He saw tools, an anvil, and a forge. Picking up a hammer, he suddenly felt inspired. An idea struck him. He needed armor to hide his appearance. He couldn't travel across the country looking like this. He would be executed at the first village. He sat at the table and found a piece of charcoal. Starting to sketch on the table, he designed armor that could conceal his wolfish features. Time flew by, and soon evening turned into night. The old man called him for dinner. Richard approached the table and tried to eat in his new form. It wasn't easy. He had to carefully pick up food with his clawed hands and avoid dropping it. The old man watched him with understanding and patience, continuing their conversation on various topics. After dinner, Richard felt tired and returned to his room. Lying on the bed, he again pondered his future and plans for the upcoming journey. With these thoughts, he gradually fell asleep, hoping that tomorrow would bring new answers and opportunities. In the morning, when Richard woke up, he headed to the forge. There he found a pile of black ore and was surprised. Eldon approached him and said, "I saw your sketch and remembered I had some ore lying around. You can use it." Richard was delighted and thanked the old man. He immediately set to work. The process took several days. He heated the ore in the forge, hammered it into shape, and then quenched it in water. Each piece of metal was carefully worked to create perfect armor plates. Richard used the hammer, anvil, and various tools to achieve the desired result. Finally, the armor was ready. He put it on and looked at his reflection in the water. The armor completely concealed his wolfish appearance. A helmet with a closed visor hid his muzzle, breastplates and backplates fit tightly to his body, and gauntlets and greaves covered his hands and legs. The armor was heavy, but he felt protected and confident in it. Richard, clad in the armor, looked imposing. Black plates with metal rivets, a symbol of a wolf's head engraved on the chest. His figure appeared taller and bulkier, fully concealing his true nature. The armor not only protected him, but also gave him an intimidating look which would help him on his journey. Richard was pleased with the result of his work. However, while smelting the ore, he realized it was unusual. Once Randolph had told him about legendary meteorite ore, and something told him that he was working with exactly that. Richard felt that it contained some special energy. He decided to use the remaining ore to forge a sword. He knew this metal could create something extraordinary and wanted a weapon worthy of his new abilities. The forging process began with preparing the ore. Richard heated the metal in the forge until it was white-hot, then took it out and began to hammer it. He worked meticulously, shaping the ore into a long, sharp blade. Each hammer strike was precise and calculated. The metal responded to his hands, becoming stronger and sharper. Several days passed, and finally, the sword took its final shape. The blade was long and broad, perfectly balanced. The hilt was decorated with a simple yet elegant pattern and wrapped in leather for a better grip. The blade of the sword shimmered with flickers of light, indicating the hidden energy within. Richard took the finished sword in his hands and felt strength and confidence fill him. He performed a few test swings, and the blade effortlessly cut through the air with a slight whistle. The sword was perfectly balanced and surprisingly light despite the metal's strength. Richard tried to use light magic, but felt a sharp pain in his body and realized it was incompatible with his current state. This discovery made him think about how to use his powers now. He decided that he would need to find another way to interact with magic, but that would come later. After that, he donned his armor and took up the sword. It turned out the armor hardly hindered him due to his new strength and form. To an onlooker, he would appear as a giant, not a monster. Swinging his sword and examining the armor, he didn't notice the old man standing nearby again. Richard hadn't even sensed his presence. Who is he really? He wondered. Eldon held a gray cloak and extended it to him. Richard was struck by the old man's generosity and was about to refuse, but he insisted. "Take it. It will help you on your journey," he said. The cloak was light but sturdy, made from the rare hide of a beast that was hard to find. It was long, reaching down to his heels, and had a large hood that could conceal his face. When Richard put it on, he felt the cloak envelop his body, creating a sense of additional protection and concealment. In this attire, he looked even more formidable. "Thank you, Eldon," Richard said, looking at himself in his new guise. "This cloak is more than I could have hoped for." "I'm proud that my materials were used to create such fine armor," the old man replied. "Now you're ready for your journey." Richard stayed with the old man for a couple more days, preparing for the journey. He checked his gear, trained with the sword, and studied the map to know the route to the south of the country, where the mage Arden lived. These days passed in peace and quiet, allowing Richard to gain confidence in his abilities. When it was time to say goodbye, he stood on the porch of the house, fully equipped. Eldon stood beside him, holding a small bundle of provisions. "Farewell," the old man said, handing him the bundle. "May luck be with you on your journey." "Thank you for everything," Richard replied, taking the bundle. "I will never forget your help." They exchanged last looks filled with respect and gratitude. Richard turned and headed into the forest. His armor gleamed in the morning light, and the gray cloak fluttered behind him. He walked, full of determination and hope, ready for any challenges that might come his way. The forest swallowed his figure, and Richard disappeared among the trees, heading toward his new goal, to find the mage Arden and break the curse to become human again.